Hey, I'm Jake Bartlett, and I just want to thank you for watching this lesson. I'm really excited to show you how to start animating some things inside of After Effects. I've been working professionally in After Effects since around 2010 and been messing around with the program a lot longer than that. So I've had a lot of experience, and even if you've never opened up the program before, I think you're going to be able to get a lot out of this. I'm going to walk you through the whole process, but what I want to do today is bring an illustration to life. So what I have here in Photoshop is an illustration that my wife started and then ended up not using. So we're going to use that as something to play around with. But basically, I want to show this snake plant growing and maybe animating the text a little bit, maybe even bringing this pot on. But with any animation, especially one involving an illustration or a design, there's a lot of prep work that has to happen in order for the file to be ready to be worked with in After Effects. So that's where we're going to start. So you can take any illustration that you want. Try and stay simple, especially if this is your first time in After Effects. Like I said, all I'm planning on doing is having these plants kind of grow out, the leaves grow out of the pot, and then maybe the text just be revealed on in the pot, also being animated on in some way. But here's what we need to do to start prepping this. First of all, label all of your layers. That will make everything much easier to read inside of After Effects. So I've went through all of my layers here and I've given each one of them a name. Staying clean and organized is essential in any project, but especially in animation. Now, you'll notice that I have a whole bunch of different layers, all labeled leaf, and they're all numbered. And this is because since I want to animate each one of these leaves growing out, I want to have individual control over each one of them. The original layer is actually right here, so let me turn that on and then turn these other leaves back off. So you can see that originally this was just one layer from a photograph. It doesn't have to be a photograph. If you illustrated your plant, that's totally fine too. But my point is this was a picture. It was one flat image, and I need access to each individual leaf. So I had to take the time to individually cut out and then fill in some cases, missing information behind leaves. So with all of these enabled, you can see it looks the same. But if I move this one out of the way, you can see there's texture on this leaf where there was no information before. So I had to use the rubber stamp tool in Photoshop and fill in some information so I could have each one of these leaves individually. And that way I can animate them all individually, maybe make them sway a little bit in After Effects. But that's some prep work that I had to do. Now, if you're working with an illustration or you're even creating an illustration for this project, you can get one step ahead and go ahead and fill in that information as you're illustrating. So if you were to do a plant and you have these overlapping leaves or branches that you know you want to animate individually, just paint each one of them on their own layer. And that way you'll have that information behind them. You won't have to do any photoshopping to get them to work. And that can work with any object. If you were making a bicycle or a house, where you want to be able to move individual elements around and you need to see what's behind them, just illustrate in what's behind them on their own layer so that when you move things around, it looks the way that it should. Now, my wife was using Procreate when she illustrated this. If you like to use Procreate, that's totally fine. Just save it as a PSD, export it from Procreate as a PSD, and then bring it into Photoshop because Procreate likes to do some weird stuff sometimes. So this text layer right here should exist only right here, but you can see the transform bounding box is around the entire document. And that should happen to every single layer that you bring in. I'm not sure why it happens, but there's a really easy fix for it. Just go up to Image, Canvas Size, and then change the canvas size to be 1 pixel larger in both dimensions. Click OK. And then the transform box is fixed. It's now snapped to the bounds of the actual artwork, the contents of that layer. And then just go back to Image Canvas Size, turn that 1 pixel back down and click OK. And then we'll be good to go. Now, resolution is something that you need to think about also in this preparation step. So right now, if I go to my image size, you can see that it's 2000 by 3000, which is great for a high resolution desktop or maybe even a print, but it's higher resolution than I need inside of After Effects. Video formats generally don't go that high, and they also generally aren't in this format. Depending on where you're going to display this really determines how you're going to want to size this. Now, if you're just going to post this as a GIF online somewhere, then you can really choose whatever resolution you want. That doesn't really matter, but GIF sizes get much bigger depending on the resolution. So I would suggest no larger than 1000 pixels on the larger edge. So I would turn that down to 1000 and let the width be whatever it is. But I'm thinking of posting this maybe on Instagram. So I actually want to change the aspect ratio. Instead of being this portrait ratio, I'm going to change it to be a square. So I'm going to switch to the crop tool with C on the keyboard, change this to a 1:1 square, and then just reposition this. And I might even need to resize some stuff, but let's say right about there is pretty good. Click the check mark to apply that. And then I'll probably just select all of my layers in here with the plant and the text. There we go. And then just scale it down a little bit while holding Shift and Alt to scale it from the center proportionally. Then I'll just place it right in the middle, press Enter, and that is now nice and scaled down. It looks like I have some transparent pixels here, probably just misaligned when I cropped. So I'm going to grab that background layer and shift that back over. And I think that's filled in nicely now. Okay, now that this is all prepped and ready to go, we should be able to bring it into After Effects. So go ahead and save your document, and then I'm going to jump over to After Effects. If you've never opened the program before, this is probably what it looks like. If it doesn't look like this, then here's what I want you to do. Go up to Window, and then to Workspace, and then down to Default. And if it's already on that and it still doesn't look this way, go to Reset Default to Saved Layout, and then it will look just like this, or at least it should. We actually don't need all of these panels, but I'm not going to bother walking through closing all of them. We're just going to focus on what we need. This might be a little bit overwhelming if you've never seen this program before. It is laid out slightly differently than Photoshop and Illustrator, but I'm just going to walk you through it really quickly. Right over here is the project panel. You can see that right at the top. This is where any assets that you want to work with, anything you want to animate, and anything that you create inside of After Effects will live. It'll show up kind of like a directory. So why don't we go ahead and start by importing the artwork that I just had in Photoshop. To do that, you can just double click right here in this section. So I'm going to double click, find that PSD right here, and click on Import. Now After Effects is immediately going to ask me, how do I want to import this PSD? I can import it as footage, which you can think of as just a flat layer, basically like a JPEG, no access to the layers that we just had in Photoshop, or I can change that to composition or composition retain layer sizes. We want this second one right here, retain layer sizes, because that whole trick that we just did in Photoshop to get the bounding box to fit the layers, retain layer sizes means that exact same thing. It's going to give us the transform bounding boxes right around the contents of the layer. So we're going to choose that option. A composition in After Effects can be thought of basically just like a PSD in Photoshop. It's a document that can contain lots of layers, and that's kind of where you do your work. So that's how we're going to import that PSD. And you don't need to worry about the layer styles options because we had none, and you probably don't either. So we'll click OK. And now we have our artwork showing up right here in the thumbnail for our project on this little icon right here. This is a composition icon. If I expand this a little bit, we can see some more data in here. I'll resize this a little bit, and it just tells you a lot of information about what you have inside of your project. So snake plant, that was the name of my PSD. That's what it's named, the composition. And then we also have this little folder icon, which I can open up, and you can see it's named snake plant layers. And in here we see a bunch of PSD icons. These are all the individual layers that are now accessible inside of Photoshop. And they're named in a way that we can tell that they all came from the same PSD, snake-plant.psd. We don't actually need to bother with that right now. I'm going to close that back up because the composition has all of those layers in it exactly the same way that Photoshop did. So if I double click on that composition, it opens up right over here in my composition panel. And I can't see the entire thing right now because I'm viewing it at 100% resolution. So if I click on this little menu right here for my composition, this is the magnification menu for my composition. So I can say fit or fit up to 100%, and that will just scale down the composition so I can see the whole thing. With any of these panels, you see that it's outlined by blue. That means that's the panel that's active. If I click on the project panel, that's the active one. This one's the active one now. But you can click and drag on the border of any of these panels to resize them however you want. If you need more real estate to see your composition a little bit bigger, feel free to resize it that way. If you need to see a different panel larger, you can at any time resize these however you want. If you have a scroll wheel on your mouse, you can zoom in and out with it just by hovering your mouse over and then scrolling on that scroll wheel. Or if you don't have a scroll wheel, there is the comma and period keys or the less than and greater than signs on the keyboard. That'll do the same thing. But I want this to stay at that fit right there. One important thing about After Effects to understand is that magnification does not equal resolution. And that's what these two menus are right here side by side. Magnification is just that, whatever magnification you're seeing your artwork or your composition at that current time. But right here, the resolution menu is how After Effects is actually displaying the pixels in your composition. So currently it's set to full, meaning we have 100% quality. Even though we're looking at it at a quarter of the magnification, it's still processing and displaying all of those pixels. If I change this to half, then things are going to display more quickly, but if I zoom into 100%, you see it does not look quite as nice. I can go all the way down to quarter. You can really see that makes everything a little bit more crunchy. This isn't too critical at this stage because we're not going to be doing things that are extremely render intensive and processor heavy. But if you're ever looking at your composition and wondering why does it look pixelated or fuzzy, it's probably because you're not viewing it at full resolution at 100%. If you zoom in past 100%, I'm at 800% now, but still viewing at full resolution, and you're like, why is that fuzzy now? It's because you're viewing it at 8 times the magnification that you should be, or at least 8 times the magnification of the final output. So I'm going to keep that set to fit for now, leave it at full unless I need to downscale it for some reason. And now I want to shift our focus to this panel down here, which is your timeline. If you've ever used a video editor before, it's very similar to that, where over on this section, we have time code up at the top of that timeline, and it's marked with seconds. I can zoom in and out down here to see more or less time within this panel. And I can scrub through with this playhead or timeline indicator to change what point in time I'm working with. Now, this isn't changing anything in my composition because my composition is just made up of this artwork, which was a PSD. There's no animation to it. But as I scroll through, you can see right here, I have time code that's changing. So if I move right around here at 10 seconds, let me explain how time code works really quickly. We start with the number of frames per second. So I'm at frame 1, 10 seconds, 0 minutes, and 0 hours. So that is how you read time code. And currently I'm working at 30 frames per second. Animation, videos, they're all made up of multiple frames, and those frames are measured in frames per second. So for every second of video, there is 30 frames played back, 30 individual pictures that are going to be put into a sequence and played back in your video. That's how video works. There are some very common animation frame rates. 24 frames per second is kind of traditional. 30 frames per second is very common. Sometimes people animate at 60 to get a very smooth, high frame rate look. But you could also go the opposite direction and do 12 or 15 frames per second to get something that looks a little bit more choppy and a little bit more just stylized. It's really up to you, but I would suggest that we just stick to 30 frames per second for now. If right here your little indicator does not show 30 frames per second, come up to Composition and go to Composition Settings, and that will bring up this window right here. And down here we have the frame rate. Change that to 30 frames per second. There are some presets you can do in the drop-down or just type it in. This is also where you would change the resolution of your composition. It's matched to what we had in Photoshop, 2000 by 2000, so that's fine for now. But you can also change the duration of your composition right here, which mine was set to 30 seconds. Yours may not have been. So just to be safe and so we're all on the same page, go ahead and change your duration to 30 seconds right there. And if for some reason this is not displaying time code, it's just giving you a number, then click cancel out of here. And what's happening is that your timeline is currently set to displaying just frame numbers and not seconds, minutes, hours. So just control click on this right here to switch from frame display to timecode display. Then go back up to composition settings, change that to 30 seconds and click OK. All right, now that we're all on the same page, let's start animating. Now, animation in After Effects is made up of what are called keyframes. A keyframe can basically be thought of as a point in time that you've set parameters to make your composition look a specific way. So this current state that we have is kind of the final keyframe, right? This is how I want my animation to resolve, with the leaves out, the text on the bottom, the pot there. This is what I want it to end up as, but I need to have it start basically off screen if that's how I want it animating it, from off screen to on screen with plants growing and stuff like that. So let's just do something really basic. I'm going to focus on the pot. Let's grab that layer. And you see that now I have this bounding box in my composition viewer. Just like in Photoshop, I can click and drag this around as long as I have my selection tool active and just position this anywhere on screen. I can also click and drag on the corner while holding Shift to scale that up or down. There's lots of things I can do here, but I'm just going to press Control-Z a couple of times to get back to where I was. And just to show you how these keyframes work, I'm going to have that pot selected and twirl open that layer. And inside here, you can see that we have Transform with another drop-down arrow. So I'm going to twirl that open, and this is where all of the transform properties for this layer are. One thing that I really love about After Effects versus Photoshop is that all of these transform controls are completely non-destructive, meaning I can always change them, I can always reset them. It's not re-rasterizing my pixels every time that I make a transformation. I could set the scale of this to 200, and even though at 100% it looks like it's losing a little bit of resolution, I could always put it back down to 100 and it's back to exactly the way that it was before. And this is what's going to allow us to animate things. So with this position property, for example, it's currently set to where it is in the composition relative to the top left corner. So 0, 0 would be this coordinate right here, the top left corner. So it's 1000.5 pixels over on the x-axis and 1346 pixels down. These numbers don't really matter. I'm just trying to explain what's happening here in After Effects. But next to each one of these properties, you can see this little stopwatch icon. This is how we set keyframes for any layer or any property or anything really inside of After Effects. Anything that has a stopwatch means that a keyframe can be applied to it. So I'm just going to go forward in time and zoom in here a little bit, say around 2 seconds, move my playhead to right there, and this is where I want the position of the pot to end up. So with my playhead in that point in time, I'm just going to click on that stopwatch for the position property, and it sets a keyframe. So that stopwatch is now blue, indicating that there's a keyframe set there. And right over here in my timeline, if I move this around, you can see there's now a diamond icon right here. That is a keyframe. That's recording the position value for that point in time. And now I can go back to, say, the beginning of my timeline, click and drag this while maybe holding Shift to constrain to just the x-axis. And I'm just going to move this all the way down to the bottom. And After Effects automatically sets another keyframe on any property that already had a keyframe. So that literally anything that you've set a keyframe on, if you move to a different point in time and change that value, it will automatically set a keyframe for you. But what's really cool about this now is with my timeline active, if I press the spacebar key, it's going to play back and animate between those two keyframes. That's what these keyframes do. They record those 2 points, those 2 values in those points in time, and then it fills in everything in between it, creating the animation. It's called interpolation, but that's a technical term. You don't need to remember that. But that's what's happening. What we told After Effects is that right here at 2 seconds, we want the position to be this value. Right here at the beginning of the timeline, we want it to be this value. And After Effects, you just fill in the rest for me, make that animation move. Now let's say that I don't like how slow that is moving. Well, I can just click and drag this keyframe, the second one, to any other point in time, let's say around 1 second, and then play that again, and now it's going to move more quickly. Now, something else I want to point out is this green bar up here. You see when I move this, it kind of goes away. That's the preview range. At first, you see as I click and drag, it's going to fill that in a little bit, but After Effects has to process every change that you make. So the first time that you play it back, it might not play it back very smoothly, but once that green preview bar is there, that means that After Effects has cached all of that and you should be able to play it back and see it in real time. Another thing we can do is set an area of the timeline that we want After Effects to preview. That's what this bar right up here is for. It's called the work area. And this is the end point or the start of my work area. If I click and drag it, you see that that's kind of highlighting a portion of my timeline. And if I zoom back out here so we can see the whole thing, here's the end point. So I can click and drag that back. And if I click in the middle, it'll drag both the in and out proportionally. So I just want to set that to be somewhere around here. And now when I play back, it's going to loop that work area. So I can watch it over and over and over again without having to continually press that space bar. Okay, so that's the basics of keyframes in After Effects. And it's really the foundation of how we're going to do all the animation for this illustration. So I'm just going to fit this to my composition window one more time, and we can move on. So the next thing I want to point out is that all of my layers are visible right now. And obviously when the pot goes off, I don't want to see all these other things. So let me collapse that pot layer right there and take a look at maybe these leaves. If I select all of them, all of these layers are getting highlighted over here in the timeline. So what I can do is actually click and drag them to the right and shift them forward in time so that they're not visible until that endpoint is reached. So I can just shift all of these layers that shouldn't be visible yet, including this text right here, forward, so that I'm only focusing on that pot to begin with. Because remember, this is how I'm kind of picturing it. The pot comes in, the leaves grow out, and then the text is revealed. Now there are some other layers in the composition that I do want to have there most of the time, like the texture up here. It's a very subtle texture, but it's all these little splotches basically of color that are on top of everything. And then at the bottom, we have another texture for the background, and then the background layer itself. There are a couple of invisible layers. That was the plant before I separated the leaves. I don't need that, so I'm going to select it and press delete. Same thing for this background layer. That's what was in Procreate. I don't need it, so I'm just going to delete it with the delete key. And then I want to lock these other layers so that I don't accidentally click and drag them to move them around. So I'll just Control Z to get out of there. And I'll just come over to this right here, this lock icon. I can just click on that and it will lock the layer so I can not do anything to it. I can't select it up here in my composition. It's just totally locked, just like in Photoshop or Illustrator. And these little eyeball icons, they work the same way as Photoshop and Illustrator too. It just enables or disables the visibility of that layer. But I'm going to lock up the background texture and the background as well. So now I can be sure that there's nothing in here I can grab except that pot or these layers further along down the line. But let's say that's how I want the pot to start. I want it to just shift in from the bottom up. And then after it makes it to that resting point, that's when I want the leaves to start coming in. So I'm going to go to right where it ends, right about there. And then I'm going to grab all of these leaves, click on the first one, shift click on the last one, and then click and drag until they show up right there. All right, so I want all of these leaves to just grow up out of that pot. But obviously I need something to hide them or some way to obscure them from, popping out the bottom of the pot. And I think the way that I want to do this is actually just by animating the scale, because I want it to look like they're growing, not just moving up and coming out of the dirt. I want them to look like they're actually increasing in scale. So we're going to use the scale property to do that. I'm going to zoom in here and then pan, which, by the way, the keyboard shortcut for that is the same as in Photoshop and Illustrator. Just hold down the space bar. That will temporarily switch to the pan tool, and then you can click and drag in your composition to pan around. Then you just let go of the space bar, and there we go. So I'm going to focus on this leaf right here. And in fact, I want to solo that layer so it's the only thing I see. There's another switch right over here in the timeline, right here, this little white dot. If I check that on, that solos that layer. You can do it for multiple layers, but it basically makes everything else disappear. All right, so what I want to point out is the little overlays that we have of this layer and what they mean. We already took a look at the transform handles on each corner in the top and bottom, left and right. That lets you scale the layer however you want. But this one right in the middle, this is the anchor point. Again, just like Photoshop. But this is the point at which all of these transformations are taking place around. So it's defaulted to the center of the layer. So if I scale this down, hold shift, it's going to scale from that point. Well, I want these leaves to grow from where the pot was. So let me turn that pot back on. Really, it's just going to be the base of the leaf, but there we go. We can see the pot now. So instead of scaling from the center of the layer, I want it to scale from down here. Well, I can shift where that anchor point is on any layer using this tool right here. It's called the pan behind or anchor point tool. If I click on that, I can then click and drag this anchor point to be anywhere that I want. So if I move it down here at the base of the leaf, right inside the pot, and then switch back to my selection tool, I can click and drag on the transform controls, and it's going to scale down from there. Now, I don't necessarily want to scale down to nothing because that looks a little bit silly. I mean, it might actually work that way, but you can tell that I'm literally just scaling that up. So I want to combine this scale animation with some position and maybe even some rotation. If I go to my rotation tool, I can click and drag this to rotate the leaf, and that way it'll just give it a little bit more uniqueness and a little bit more organic feel. So we're going to add a couple of keyframes to this leaf. I'm going to scale this up just so I can see it a little bit better. But we're going to go back into the transform controls for the leaf and then into transform controls and set a keyframe on the scale as well as the position, and let's go ahead and set one on the rotation as well. So now I have 3 layers of keyframes in here for each one of these transform controls. And a really handy keyboard shortcut in After Effects is the U key. If I press that U key with that layer selected, it will bring up just the properties that have keyframes applied. And I can press U again, it'll collapse the entire layer. So U brings up all of those keyframes and makes it a lot easier to get to just the properties that you're concerned with. Now, these 3 keyframes that I just set are the ones that I want this leaf to end up as, right? The resolved state of this layer. So I want to shift all 3 of these forward in time. So to select all 3, I'm just going to click and drag to make a selection around all 3 of them right here in my timeline. Blue means they're selected, and then I'll just click and drag them forward maybe 1.5 seconds, roughly. This is all arbitrary at this point. But then I want to scale it down, which I don't have to do right here interactively in the composition viewer. I could just grab the scale property and scale that back a little bit. So maybe I'll scale it that far down, and then I'll click and drag it down so that it's in the pot and pan around to make sure I'm not going out the bottom here, but just enough so that it's covered up. And then maybe I'll also rotate it a little bit, maybe this direction. So we'll rotate it. And this rotation property, it's giving me degrees, but if I go all the way around, it's going to basically cycle or add a revolution to that. Not entirely important right now, but I just wanted to point that out. So I'm going to rotate that back about maybe there, and then just shift it down so that it's completely hidden. Now if I click and drag to scrub through, you can see what's happening. It's scaling up, it's rotating, and it is moving into that final position. So we can change all of these properties. Like I said, it's all non-destructive. So I can, if I get further along in this process and I don't like the way that particular leaf is looking, I can always adjust it. But now I just want to do basically the same thing for all the other leaves. So let's just go through that really quickly. I'm going to collapse that layer. And now that we know how it works, I'm going to unsolo these other layers. I don't think it'll be too confusing. And we're just going to grab these leaves one at a time and start by just shifting their anchor point. So switch to that anchor point tool, click and drag this anchor point to where it meets the pot, basically the base of the leaf, and repeat that process for each one of them. That's this leaf right here. You just turn the visibility on and off to be sure I know which leaf I'm dealing with, and then move that down to the base. Next layer, move that one down. I believe that's, yep, that background leaf. Then we've got this one in the foreground, move that about here. And then finally, we have this big one in the front. I'll move that down here. And now all those anchor points are set, and we can start setting those same keyframes for position, scale, and rotation. So let's find out if we're at the right point for that last leaf. I'll press U. We are. That's the point in time we want all of these to kind of resolve. At least at this point, we might want to change that in a little bit, but I can actually set keyframes for all of these layers at once. If I shift click on all of them, so I had the first one selected, hold shift, click on the last one, and then I can twirl all of these open at once, go into the transform controls and set a position, scale, and rotation keyframe. But because I had all those layers selected, it added keyframes to each one of them. So with all those layers selected now, I'll press the U key, and that shows me the keyframes for each one of those properties that I just set. So all of those are set. I'll now go back to the in point of the layer, which the keyboard shortcut, very handy, is I to get to the in point, O for the out point. So I for in, or another way that you could have done this is just with your playhead, scrubbing that in time, hold the Shift key, and that will snap to different points. So keyframes, layer start and end points, or even the work area. So I'm just going to hold Shift, snap it to that point, and now I can individually move each one of these, scale them, rotate them however I want. So let's just start with this big one right here. I'll scale it down and maybe rotate it back this direction, which, by the way, I'm really used to keyboard shortcuts, so when you see me switch to different tools, it's probably because I'm using a hotkey, but the rotation tool right here, W, is the keyboard shortcut, and that allows you to click and drag to rotate. V is the selection tool, so I'll just switch to that, and then click and drag that down, and then I'll move on to this one. I'll scale it, hold Shift to constrain the proportions, make it maybe not quite so small, and then I'll rotate it back and then slide it down. And we'll switch to this layer here and do the same thing. Scale it down, maybe rotate it a little bit, and move it down. So once you have all of these leaves however you want them, we'll be able to play it back and see how all of them are working together to create a cool little animation. So now that that's done, let's just play this back. We have the pot slide in, and then we have all these leaves growing out. It's not all that exciting at this point, but we can see all these individual layers and the plants growing. It's looking pretty cool. We're creating an animation, and that should be exciting to you. So we're gonna refine this and make it look a lot better than it already does. But let's focus on this last element, the snake plant text. That's the last element that really needs to be animated in, and we're going to do it a little bit differently. So I'm going to deselect all of my layers just by clicking on a point in my timeline right here where no layers are, and then just press U. That will bring up all the keyframes, and press U one more time to collapse all of those keyframes. Then I'm going to scroll down in my timeline and find that text layer, and I'll zoom in nice and close and pan around so we can see the word snake plant. We're going to stick to very basic things in this short lesson. After Effects can do so many different things, but just like in Photoshop, you can apply effects to layers and stylize things. Some effects in After Effects will completely change the way that your layer looks, while other ones can be used more like transitions and be used to reveal things, and that's exactly what we're going to do right here. So over in this section of panels, there's one called Effects and Presets. I'm going to click on that, and this is just a quick way to search for effects or browse the effects that you have available to you in After Effects. So I'm going to search for one called Linear Wipe. So Linear Wipe, and it's under the transition category. I'm going to click and drag that onto that layer, just right here in the composition viewer, and I can see that's highlighting this is the layer I'm going to apply it to, and let go. And over here where our project panel was, we now have an effects controls panel. And just like it sounds, this is where we control the parameters of an effect. So currently, the transition completion property is set to 0, but if I click and drag that, you can see that it's going from 0 to 100%, basically wiping this layer off and back on. I also have the ability to change the wipe angle, so if I don't want it to go from, say, right to left, I could change this to -90 degrees. I'll just type in -90. And now as I go from 100 to 0%, it is going to basically write it on. I could even, feather this a little bit if I wanted it to be softer, but honestly, I'm totally fine with it being a harsh edge. And maybe I'll just angle it just slightly, just for fun. That way it comes in at an angle. But now all I have to do to get this to animate is set a keyframe for the start and end points of this transition completion value. So at the beginning of my layer, if I click and drag while holding Shift to get to the end point of that layer, I can set a keyframe at the transition completion set to 100%. So I'll do that, and then I'll move forward in time arbitrarily. Again, I don't even know how far that was, but I'll then just change this value down to 0, and After Effects is going to interpolate that for me and automatically animate that on. So I'll set my work area right here so I can see it happen, and it just kind of quickly draws on that text. And I think even though that's really simple, that's going to work just fine. I want to keep this project simple since it's such a short class, but it's just a very simple and effective little effect for revealing that text. So as a whole, we've got the pot coming in, the plants growing out, and the text wiping on. Now at this point, this is where I want to focus on timing and basically smoothing everything out. So with this pot coming on, I'm happy with how fast it moves, but everything is very linear, meaning this is point A, this is point B, it's moving at a constant rate, and there's no smoothness of this motion. And this is where the whole motion design aspect comes into motion design, where I'm going to kind of design how everything is moving so that it's a little bit more pleasing to look at. So let's start with the pot. I'll select that layer and press U to bring up the keyframes, and then just press plus or minus on the keyboard to zoom in and out, and just get these two keyframes a little bit more in view. I'm also going to set my work area out point to be right after this. So the keyboard shortcuts for setting your work area start and end point are B and N, and I think they just chose them because they're next to each other, and you can kind of think of beginning and end for the N, but I'm going to press N on the keyboard, and that will snap the end of my work area to that point in time. So I can look at just that point of the animation. Now, like I said, there's no smoothness happening here at all. It's 100% linear, point A to point B. What I want to do is kind of ease into that second value so that it's moving faster at the start, slowing down towards the end, and just gets to a nice resting point a lot more gradually. And to do that, we're going to use what's called easing inside of After Effects. So let's select that last keyframe right there, and we're going to use a preset basically. So I'm going to move this up a little bit so we can just see this whole menu, and I'll right click on that keyframe. Down at the bottom is Keyframe Assistant, and right here is Easy Ease. This is going to be your friend in your beginning of your journey to animating things in After Effects. It's basically just the default automatic easing of keyframes. So just click Easy Ease. And what this is going to do is smooth out getting to that value, changing the interpolation between point A and point B so that we get to that at a more smooth or gradual rate. So let me play that back and you can see the difference. It's a little bit subtle, but you can clearly tell that it is gradually getting to that resting point. If I undo and get to that standard linear keyframe, it's pretty clear what's happening, right? This is eased. It kind of gradually gets to that point, and this is not eased. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is honestly just easy ease everything, and you'll see what a difference it makes. So let's watch this one more time without any easing. So it comes up, those plants grow, the text wipes on. Very rigid, boring, not a lot of personality. Then I'm going to press U until I see all of my keyframes. There we go. And give myself plenty of room here because I want to select all of them at once. And to do that, I'm just going to click and drag one more time right there, and then drag all the way to the bottom. It'll automatically scroll, and there I have all of my keyframes selected. Then I'll right click on any one of them, go to Keyframe Assistant, and say Easy Ease. So now the start and end keyframes of everything has been eased, and we'll play it back to see what that looks like. All right, so it's much more smooth now. It might be hard for you to see if you've never had to deal with animation before, but let me just undo one more time. This is without the easing. Everything's kind of just like boop, 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 very rigid. And then with easing enabled, it's just more gradual. And I'm going to quickly basically exaggerate this smoothing. You do not need to know how to do this. I don't really want you to concern yourself with this at this stage in animating, but I'm going to go into what's called the graph editor in After Effects, and this is kind of a visual graph representation of the velocity of all of my keyframes, or the rate of change between keyframes. It's very confusing if you don't know what you're looking at, and like I said, you don't need to worry about it, but I'm basically going to take these default easing values and increase them to be much more dramatic, and then we're going to just preview this one more time and see what it looks like now. Now that it's way more exaggerated, it's much more apparent what's actually happening, right? It's speeding up and slowing down. It's easing in and out of every motion a lot more gradually. So that's what easing is doing. And I'll just undo this to get back to where we were. The default Easy Ease is going to be just fine for this project. But that's what's happening when we apply those Easy Ease keyframes. So here we are back at our base Easy Ease standard movement. Now what I want to do is retime some of this so that all of the plants aren't growing out at the exact same time. So I'll press U once more to get rid of those keyframes. And basically, I just want to stagger these plants, the leaves of the plants, to come in at different times. And all I have to do that is have my selection tool active, and then just click and drag these layers around so that they aren't happening at the exact same point in time. So let's just play that back and see what it looks like. All right, so they don't all come out at once. I could probably exaggerate this even a lot further if I just randomize this. Again, this is all arbitrary. I'm just playing around at this point, but now you can really see those leaves are all staggered the way that they're growing out. I don't particularly like this one leading, so I'm going to move that towards the end of the timeline and maybe just rearrange some of these a little bit. But you can play around with the timing of all of your individual layers to get a different feel of how everything is animating in. I do need to be careful though, because the pot didn't come to a resting point before this layer popped on. So I'm just going to shift that forward to this point in time. And that way the leaves stay invisible until the pot has come to a rest. So I'm going to fit that, make this a little bit bigger. And I think the text comes on a little bit too quickly at the end. I want to give it some breathing room between the leaves coming in and the text coming on. So I just shifted that forward. Let's play this back. Pot comes on, leaves grow out, and the text is revealed. I also think that might happen a little too quickly, so with that layer selected, I'll press U and maybe double the length of that. And let's take a look at this a little bit bigger. So there we go. We did, very basic things like adding keyframes in the position, scale, and rotation. We added one effect, and we did a little bit of easy easing. But this hopefully gives you a little bit of a taste into how you can start to make things move inside of After Effects from the perspective of the Procreate and Photoshop world. And like I said, After Effects is a huge program. It has a whole lot of different applications that it can be used for, but for bringing illustrations to life, it's actually fairly straightforward. You don't have to do a whole lot if you're bringing in your own artwork and you just want to give it a little bit of life. But now that we have our animation looking the way that we want, how do we get it out of After Effects into a format that we can actually share, like on social media? Well, that's what we're going to do next. So the first thing I want to do is set my work area to whatever duration I want my video to be, because that's what After Effects is going to export. It's going to give us a video the length of my work area. So after that final text comes out, I'm gonna just press spacebar when I want the video to end, basically. So maybe right there. So we landed around 6 seconds. So I'm just gonna round that off to 6 seconds even, and then press N on the keyboard to set my work area out point. That will be the duration of my video clip. However, 6 seconds isn't long enough to post to Instagram. You need 10 seconds at least for a video to be able to post on Instagram. And chances are you're probably going to want your animation to loop. So we need to build in that loop. And to do that, we're going to go back to our project panel over here. And I'm going to actually drag this composition down to the composition button. It's the new composition button. If I click and drag it and let go, it's going to create a second composition that contains the composition we were just working in as a single layer. The composition is now just one layer inside of this new composition. But if I click and drag, you can see that all of our animation is preserved. That's basically a group, like a folder inside of Photoshop. It's containing everything that we were working with. And you see that I just double clicked on it and went straight back to that composition with all of the layers and keyframes. And we now have tabs for these different compositions. Now I want to rename this new composition. So with it selected in the project panel, I'm just going to press enter, and I'm going to just get rid of that too and call this loop, and press enter one more time. Now I'm going to go to 6 seconds in time in this composition, and let's find that 6 seconds right there. I'll zoom in a little bit closer. The page up and page down keys also step forward 1 frame at a time. So there I'm at 6 seconds, and what I want to do is trim this layer so that it ends at that point. So I can do that by zooming out all the way, clicking and dragging on the end while holding shift, and that will snap it to that playhead. So now that composition is just 6 seconds long. And because it's the right length for the loop, I can now duplicate this layer and basically offset it and just repeat that clip over and over again. So with that layer selected, I'll press Control D. Then I'll just click and drag this new duplicate over while holding Shift so that it snaps to the playhead. The start of this layer is snapping to the end of that layer. And now that's over 10 seconds, but I'm just gonna do it a couple more times. Control D, click and drag while holding Shift, and maybe one more time for good measure. So I have 4 loops built into my video clip. Okay, so now this composition is still set to 30 seconds long, and my work area is set to that full 30 seconds. Remember, After Effects is going to export whatever you have your work area set to. So I'm going to click and drag that while holding Shift to snap it to the end of the last clip. And if I play this back, you'll notice that it just plays the first clip, goes 6 seconds forward, and then it loops, right? Very simple, but it's going to play that sequence 4 times to give me a video clip that has that built-in loop 4 times, and that will, exceed that 10-second minimum length for Instagram and allow me to post that to Instagram. Now that that's done, I'm going to go up to Composition, and I'm going to say Add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. It's a mouthful, but basically Adobe Media Encoder is a compression software that Adobe bundles with Creative Cloud. You can send things from Premiere there, from After Effects, but this is what's going to allow us to compress this video so that it's in a format that we can then post to Instagram and share online. Now, I cannot believe that I just thought of this, but I have not once saved my project file. So I'm going to tell you this now. Do as I say, not as I do. Save early, save often. I got that from my friend EJ, but this project should have been saved as soon as I imported the artwork. So I'm going to go up to File, Save, give the project file a name. I'll just call this Snake Plant, and it'll be the After Effects project format. Click Save, and there we go. Fortunately, my computer didn't crash while I was recording this, so everything is good to go. But now that I've sent that to Adobe Media Encoder, and when you send a composition to Adobe Media Encoder, it will automatically open, and we'll see in this queue panel that Snake Plant Loop. That's the name of the composition. It will be in the queue, and this is where we can choose the video format that we want to export it, as well as the compression setting that we want to use. Now, I have a bunch of my own presets, but we don't need any of those actually. We're going to go to the system presets. Actually, first of all, we're going to choose H.264 as our video format. So that's going to export an MP4 video file. So start there under Format, change this to H.264, and then under the preset, we can actually do it right here. We want to use Match Source High Bitrate. And that's basically going to look at all of the settings that we had in our composition and just match them and give us a very high bitrate, high quality video file. Now, there is one thing that we could change, which is the resolution. My document was set to 2000 pixels wide. Instagram should scale that down for me, but if you wanted to, you could click on this preset right here. What it's going to do is open up the composition inside of Media Encoder, basically, and allow us to change some parameters. It might take a little bit, as it has to talk to After Effects in order to do this, but it's going to bring up this window right here, and underneath the Video tab, this is all very confusing, I know. There's a lot to look at here, but under Video, especially with my screen resolution, it's hard, but there's a width and height. It's set with this checkbox right here, which is the Match Source checkbox, so it's sticking to what we had inside of After Effects. But I could scale this down. If I uncheck that, I could scale it down to 1080 by 1080, which is the HD resolution at 1:1 for Instagram. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that and click OK. But again, you don't have to do that. Instagram will resize the video file for you. But once that's done, just the last step is go to your output file column and choose where you want to save this video file so that you know where it's going to be once you're done exporting it, and click on Save. This is ready to go now, and you can click the green play button, and Media Encoder is going to then export that video, and you'll even see a little output preview so that you can know what point in time it's at. But I'm just gonna edit through this fast forward so that you don't have to sit here watching it in code. And now that it's done, you can simply just click on this blue text under the output file column, and that will bring up the directory that the video file was put in. There's my MP4, I can double click on it, and here is our video playing back with really great quality. It looks perfect, and it has that built-in loop of the 4 cycles of that animation. I can now transfer this to Instagram through Google Drive or Dropbox or AirDrop, whatever you want to use, and put that onto my Instagram, share it on social media, anywhere I want. But that's how you get your video file out of After Effects and into a playable format. So That was a very quick rundown. I hope that I didn't go too fast and that you were able to follow along. Obviously, rewatch this video if you need to, but that is just the tip of the iceberg of what After Effects is capable of. Obviously, I've been using the program for a long time to do a lot of things. I love the software and I love being able to create all different types of projects with it. If you're interested in learning more about it, be sure to check out my classes on Skillshare. That's where I post the bulk of my content. But I also have a YouTube channel that's Jake in Motion. You can find me basically anywhere on social media at Jake in Motion. And I always try to make myself available to my students. So if you have any questions, comments, any trouble at all, just shoot me an email. It's jake@jakeinmotion.com, and I'd be happy to help you work through anything you're trying to figure out. So thank you so much for watching this lesson, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.